Hey folks, welcome to Heroscape Strategems, the fireside chat designed to get you to the next level of Heroscape play faster than stealth flying. I'm here with a guest that needs very little introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. 7-time OHS champion, ScapeCon 2023 world champion. I'm pleased to welcome to the chairs Chris Perkins.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm very glad you're here. ScapeCon 2023 world champion. We're recording this before ScapeCon 2024, even though this won't be released until after the convention, but I still expect a very strong performance from Chris this year, who also had the most number of wins at the 2023 ScapeCon in addition to the world champion. So I brought Chris here for a very specific reason, and that is that he is one of the best. The topic here today is a very high-level topic to start out with, but in a sense it's still pretty broad. And I felt like Chris was the right person to talk about to push this forward, thinking 7 moves ahead. Now, chess grandmasters are expected to see about 7 moves ahead at any time. Well-known chess grandmaster Bobby Fischer, one of the world's greatest players, was said to be able to see 3 to 4 moves ahead with just a glance at the board, and further given like 5 seconds to analyze. So with how much variance exists in Heroscape, you may think it's impossible to plan this far ahead. And I disagree. While the game state can vary in individual hexes, a general strategy can be established out to 7 order markers or further. I have also found in certain games and matchups that it might be useful to plan out 2 full rounds in order to take advantage of a glyph like Dagmar. Additionally, bonding armies need at least a 2 order marker foresight to ensure that the bonding squad doesn't get in the way of the bonding hero, and all of this begins the moment you place down your armies or even before. So why don't we go start with that? Chris, how would you go about analyzing a tournament, analyzing a format, and analyzing a start zone?
Yeah, of course. Well, there's a lot to unpack in there. In terms of like analyzing a tournament, it depends on the tournament. There's different information that you have access to ahead of time. For something like ScapeCon, you get a very definitive list of maps, and in the case of this year, maps plus glyphs, which is a new thing, I believe, in terms of having such a definitive, knowing where all the glyphs are going to be ahead of time. So when you have a list like that, you could do a lot more specific prep work, where certain things are going to be on certain maps, especially for the World Championship format this year, where each draft pool is directly associated with a single map. So like when you're practicing the pool, you know exactly what map and what glyphs it's going to be on with like 100% certainty. That's probably quite different than what most of us see in, say, a local or an online event that's a little bit less rigorously defined ahead of time, where, maybe you're not sure what exactly the maps and the glyphs and whatnot will be. But, if you have access to that information, it's just a different additional piece of, layering that you can do. In terms of like dealing with the start zone itself, like, when you show up to a natural game and you're looking to put your stuff out, I like to try to reverse engineer that if I'm in a situation where I've spent enough, significant time ahead of time to plan things out. By reverse engineer, I mean, where do all of my pieces want to end up after 1 to 2 moves? And, plan that out, and then you can sort of backtrack where things have to end up in your start zone in order to all reach those spots without interfering with each other. That interference can be quite important to avoid, especially when you're playing bonding armies like heavies with Grimnak or Narak, for instance. It's very easy to put a heavy Grut somewhere that blocks Narak from getting where he needs to on order marker 3, and then you find yourself in a world of hurt where you can't get Narak into the spot that he needs to be into. Looking a few moves ahead as to where you want everything to end up being, and then just sort of backtracking what you have to do over the couple turns to reach that state.
In online events, it's a lot easier since you have a week or even 2 weeks to look at the map and look at the matchup specifically and think about how you want to set up. And you can even place the figures beforehand, set them in position, and then just remove them and paste them back into place. For an in-person tournament with a lot of maps, obviously ScapeCon, you end up playing on the maps quite a bit throughout the course of the week, but just for a local tournament, how do you go about either remembering what you want to do beforehand or quick on the spot analyzing a map and a board state and that kind of thing, taking advantage of a glyph or analyzing how the glyphs interact with a specific matchup or that type of thing?
Yeah, so for a local, the answer is I probably just wouldn't care at all ahead of time, to be frank. I wouldn't put the level of effort into it. It'd be tough to do, even if you wanted to. For something like GameCon specifically, for me at least, it's really a question of prioritization. So, like, which events do I care enough, or rather, which events do I need to put the effort into ahead of time to give myself a good shot to succeed over the course of the weekend? In terms of like preparing start zones, I think that for this year, that probably leads to two specific events: Reverse the Whip and the Cheese Reinforcements event. Those are two of the three main events that are happening at ScapeCon. But specifically, those are the two where it's going to be a lot more definitive about what armies I'm playing each time. The other one is the Bring 2 event, where I could end up playing my opponent's armies a ton, and the level of prep work that I put in with my builds might end up just not mattering at all. Whereas for like Reverse the Whip, I'm certain that I'm going to play my army 3 times. For Cheese, I know I'm going to play that army 5 times at least, and I know that those are events where the difference between succeeding or failing in those events has a much higher impact on the overall weekend success for me than some of the other side events might. So that's just sort of a prioritization of like which events do I need to prep the most for. In terms of how I would do that prep, I do it most of it online maps. I don't tend to build a lot of physical maps in person unless I'm bringing them to a local tournament that I need to. So all the 9 ScapeCon maps are available online. I'll import my figures, to each map, plan out the start zone, and then just take a picture of it with my phone. And then I can look at those pictures again morning of the event, or whichever, if it's Reverse the Whip, look at the pictures for Reverse the Whip to see how I was planning on dispersing my pod to get everything to where it needs to be, and so forth. And then just save those pictures and have them available. In terms of the glyphs themselves, I think that one of the biggest factors that can impact some armies there, though, is when you have figures that are able to reach glyphs on some maps but not others. So for instance, like Marku or Thrakus or a 8-move melee figure or something, right, where on some maps it's able to reach a certain glyph within 1 move and on others is not. Or Eldgrim overextending, although that usually can reach almost any glyph. If you can reach a glyph within 1 move, that might have a outsized impact on how you place your start zone, because maybe you want to prioritize one of those couple spots that's within, say, 7-move flying to get Marku onto that glyph at some point in time. Whereas if you can't reach that, you might end up dumping Marku back into your start zone to get something else towards the front of the start zone in that higher EV spot on the map for you to put something in.
Those are good ideas. Just to clarify for our audience to make sure this is as accessible as possible, when Chris is talking about Bring 2 and Reverse the Whip, meaning his preparation matters a little less, Reverse the Whip is a format where every round you switch armies with your opponent. So round 1, you would play the army that you brought, but round 2, your opponent for that round would hand you their army, and you would play against your own army, and so on and so forth. Through the main event here at ScapeCon, it's 4 or 5 rounds to determine a top cut, and then there's a single elimination later in the afternoon. And then Bring 2 is a format where you bring 2 armies, and your opponent brings 2 armies, and they get lumped into a pool, and you pick from there. Those are different than cheese reinforcements or any other more straightforward Bring 1, something like General Wars or whatever, where you would only play 1 army for the whole tournament. Your army doesn't change at all, start to finish. Just to make sure we're all on the same page about why that preparation would matter less for those types of formats specifically.
Yeah, I think it matters a lot less for Bring 2 in that regard, or at least not that it matters less, but I think that you can gain more value by doing it for Bring 2, just because you may not end up playing it at all. For Reverse the Whip, I think it matters quite a bit more for Reverse the Whip, though. I think one of the big edges is that exists in that format is when you sit down to play stuff out, if you can figure out how your opponent's army is supposed to be placed better than they can figure out how your army is supposed to be placed in whatever that 5-minute gap window you have or setup is, like, that can be a pretty meaningful impact on the overall outcome of the match.
Yeah, I guess when talking about matchup factors, what helps you determine more broadly maybe who has an edge, or maybe what your opponent's strategy would be? And in Reverse the Whip, again, since you're switching armies, your opponent might not have the most optimal strategy to start with. But in a bring one, certainly your opponent will seem to have something they want to open with, something they want to achieve with that army. How do you determine, again, even from a very basic level, how do you determine how you think a game is going to play out? Melee into melee, range into range, etc., special tools on the board, anything like that.
I think it's important if you're going to, look at that question to break it down into basically have a separate answer for all the different types of matchups you could run into. Like range versus melee is just going to be a drastically different thing in terms of how it's going to play out than range versus range or melee versus melee. And to be clear, when you don't have to have like 100% of things falling into this category. For range versus melee, I really just mean one army has a significant range advantage over the other. So, like maybe the melee player still has mesos or something, right? But the army I'm classifying as range in the example here might have Savaris, or, your range you just have such a big range advantage, it's going to dictate how the match goes. So if you're looking at something like that, where one side has just a big range advantage, they're going to be able to dictate where on the map the battle happens, because they can force their opponent to come to them on any reasonable modern tournament map that's not massive. They're just able to use that range advantage to force the battle to come into them. And so that forces their opponent to, in some way, stage their army sort of charging towards that spot where their opponent has decided that they want to have the battle take place. There are some games where that person with the range advantage is going to be incentivized to push up to height. There's some units that just really need to be on height to maximize. For example, microcore agents. There's also some situations, though, where your opponent might have such a range advantage that they're fine just sitting in their start zone and waiting for you to come there, because they would rather shoot at you the entire way across the map as you come over there. Some of the Laglor pod type armies can potentially fall into that category. Something like Laglor with the 53rd North Carolina Snipers, which is a BC unit that can have a ton of range if you set it up with Laglor and things like that. Depending on... The short version with all that is the person with the range advantage there gets to dictate where the battle should be happening. In terms of melee versus melee, a big effect on that one is going to be the glyphs in particular, because if neither of you has much in the way of a ranged presence, then the battle really could take place wherever your armies sort of happen to smash into each other at. You're definitely both incentivized to try to get height in that situation. If you can get your melee pod onto height and your opponent is not on height to you, then that's going to be a big advantage. But the glyphs are pretty massive in a spot like that. Some glyphs aren't going to matter a ton, but then others are going to be pretty massive. Wannick is going to force you to play towards that side of the map, because if your opponent is sitting on the Wannick side and you're sitting on the other side, you're just going to slowly lose your army and have no chance. Valda is another glyph that's pretty big in melee-to-melee matchups. Dagmar as well. Valda is going to help you reinforce more consistently and stay up to maximal attack activations better than your opponent is in that type of a matchup. Dagmar is going to potentially give you the spot to go for an initiative switch if you happen to lose initiative one round going to the next one. And there's some armies that have some more cool sort of techie ways to handle that. Grimnack Heavies, for example, if you are playing into an initiative switch with that glyph, you can go for a chomp, move stuff in, go for a second chomp, and if you can get those, if you get those two chomps back to back, you can create quite a hole sort of in the where your opponent's army position was established, and then cause some havoc based on that. Range versus range is probably going to depend more on the map than anything else. Some maps end up being like sort of two hill maps where there's two different high grounds where you and your opponent sort of naturally both climb towards one of those and then just shoot at each other. Those are usually not the more interesting games because neither of you are ever really incentivized to come down off your hill, charge towards the other person. Some maps that are going to be more one hillish where like there's this very central high ground. For example, in the ScapeCon pool, Flaxen Shard and Crumbling Castle, I would say, fall into that category, where you and your opponent are both kind of, despite the fact that you have a lot of range, you're both kind of incentivized to get towards that center height. Because if you don't and your opponent does, then they're going to have height on you for the entire rest of the game. And that's not a fun place to find yourself in. Yeah, sort of an overview there on the different types of matchups that you might run into for that.
Yeah, that's excellent. And to sort of swing that into actual gameplay then, really setting down your order markers and rolling for initiative, what affects how you personally place order markers. So, for example, what determines whether or not you might move Raylin at all in a high-level beat cheese game, or what determines your order marker sequence? Now, the easy answer here is that you just bring an army where there's only one obvious order marker spot. I know you're a fan of playing more complex things. What determines how you're placing your order markers in at the very start of the game to set yourself up for success in later rounds?
So there's a couple things. I think we'll try to hit on 3 here. The first is just the matchup itself. In terms of how that could play out, we already talked a little bit about who has the range advantage. So that's going to have a pretty massive impact. In the example of a Raylin placement, if your opponent has the range advantage, you're going to have to be much more aggressive placing your Raylin further forward to cover your units as you try to charge in to close that gap. Whereas if you have the range advantage, you're probably going to keep your cheerleader units like Raylin further back and safe because there's no reason to risk them moving them forward like that. Another question when you're looking at the matchup is like, how soon can my opponent's army just like be in my face as a threat? So as an example of that, if your opponent has a bunch of Templar cavalry, you probably shouldn't order marker one Raylin 6 moves out of your start zone into the center of the map because she's just going to get hit by Templar immediately and killed, right? But if they're a super, super slow army, maybe like Knights without Gilbert, for example, maybe you can get away with throwing your Raylin really far forward because you're going to have a lot more time to get your other units around her and protect her on that forward deployed high ground where you sent her to, if your opponent has to move a lot slower to catch her. So what like the speed of your opponent's units and the types of units that they've got, and like how aggressively they can counter you moving forward towards high ground with your Raylin or whatever other cheerleader type unit you have. And then there's also always a question of like what units that come into this map might alter the normal incentive structures a little bit. So normally high ground is worth 1 additional attack dice and 1 additional defense dice, for example. That's true for most things. But for microcore agents, being on height is like super extra good for them because they get a second die in that type of situation. So if your opponent has microcore and you have some kind of a Raylin pod, the additional weird incentives in that spot, or even though they have, maybe a lot of range, or regardless of whether you have range or not, you're very incentivized to get your Raylin towards maximum height immediately. Because if she's not on maximum height, the microcores are going to be able to get 3 attack to 4 on her every turn and drop her pretty quickly. Whereas if you can get her up to the maximum height spot, then you deny them that ability to get their +2 attack dice ever, and they have to settle for attacks of 2v3, which is just going to take a ton longer to kill Raylin. Now, some maps don't let you do that within 1 move out of the start zone, and some do, right? So there are some maps where you're going to be able to move Raylin towards a max height spot within 1 move, so within 6 spaces of your start zone, and there's going to be some where you can't. If you're playing into that matchup, you hope that you're on one of the maps where you can, but sometimes that's out of your control. But those types of the units that alter the normal incentive structures are just going to make you have to pause and sort of reconsider what you should be doing with that type of a setup. Speaking of the map, I'd say that the map itself is the second biggest thing when talking through this type of question. Some maps have just way better Raylin perches, for example, than others. There's some maps that have jungle shadow combos where you can be on a shadow tile next to a jungle tree. Raylin with 5 defense is pretty sick. There are some maps where you have really nice perches where you can like put a single hex figure like Raylin onto, where it's isolated on high ground so that even all the stuff next to it doesn't have you height advantage on that. There's some maps where you can get a really nice line of sight blocker in the middle of the map, where you can throw your Raylin behind it while you're able to cover your entire army as it develops, but your opponent can't see Raylin with their range stuff, so they can't shoot at her. And there's also like, what are the glyphs on the map? Sometimes you're going to be on a map where both glyphs are going to be relevant to the matchup. Sometimes that's not going to be the case. Maybe there's a Loden on one side and neither you nor your opponent have much D20 powers. In that situation, the whole game is probably going to play to the other side of the map, towards that other glyph. And so, maybe you wanted to pull your Raylin more off to that side in that instance, to somewhere where you can actually cover whatever that other glyph is, especially if it's a good glyph. Whereas if both glyphs matter, maybe you want to try and develop a little bit more of the start zone. Not up the start zone, but up the middle of the map, to where you're able to then counter deploy to either side, depending on where your opponent goes to. And then lastly, I would say also just like looking at your own army. In the case of Raylin, one important question there is, how long can your units survive without Raylin? If your army is super, super, super fragile, then you probably need to make sure that it stays within Raylin's aura the whole way up. But on the flip side, if your army has a lot of survivability even without Raylan, then maybe you can afford to move some of those other units forward first, and then move Raylan forward afterwards in a little bit more of a conservative placement than otherwise. Whereas if your army is super fragile and your opponent has the range advantage, you're probably just throwing Raylan super far forward to cover as much space as you can while your army tries to charge in at your opponent.
Sorry, would you mind giving some examples of what you would consider a very fragile Raylan army versus a more sturdy Raylan army?
A lot of the armies I've played in the past for Reverse the Whip, I would consider very fragile Raylan armies. These are armies where you have 1 to 2x of a bunch of commons, and Raylan as sort of the backbone to it, or some of the unique squads. So, for instance, I play a lot of Nikitas and Kazuke in Reverse the Whip events. I find that I get a lot of value out of those units. Both of those units have 3 defense normally, and they're a unique squad where once you lose 1 or 2 of them, the activations go down tremendously. Like those units, if they get caught outside Raylan's aura, especially the Kazuke versus like any kind of range, they're just gonna die immediately. Gonna have a huge, that's what's gonna set you back drastically in the game. So you need to keep those units in the aura pretty much at all times, because even one attack from range onto the Kazuke outside the aura is just devastating for your development and your offensive potential for the rest of the game. The flip side of that might be if you're running Raylan with, say, 10th Regiment X5. They're still a little bit fragile, but you can afford to lose 1 or 2 of them in a spot where they're outside the aura if it's beneficial to you for some other reason without too much of an issue, just because you have so many of them. Or you've also got armies where you're running Raylan with very high defense figures. For example, maybe you're running Raylan with heavies, 4 heavies, Grimnak, Narak. In that army, I would say that probably the most fragile piece that you're trying to take care of with Raylan is Narak. Whereas the heavies themselves has so much defense between the Narak boost and the Grimnak boost that they might be able to survive for a little while outside the aura in a way that some of those more fragile, lower defense or unique squads just can't handle.
Gotcha. So fragility both in terms of the number of defense dice, but also how valuable a specific figure is, commons versus uniques or high value heroes. That's very insightful.
So one of the other questions to ask yourself sort of when you're rolling your army out of the start zone is, which order markers do you need the most to be on certain figures? Some units really benefit more than others from having specific order markers early in the game on them. Going back to the Microcore example, Microcore agents really, really want to have the first couple order markers on them, because the most value you're ever going to get out of them is getting them to high ground before your opponent does in that early game, where they're able to get shots off with the extra +2 attack dice. A VC unit that's going to have very specific order marker incentives is the Varkanen's Swift Fangs, where on order marker 1 they get +2 move and +1 attack, which is obviously a awesome thing that you want to take advantage of. Grut armies tend to want to get Narak into the right spot early on, whether that right spot is on height or next to Jungle Shadow or something like that, because Narak is just so fragile, and the other orcs are going to benefit from that aura a lot if you can keep Narak alive for a long time into the game. And so with moving something like Raylan out, I think oftentimes the question is like, which order marker in round 1 or round 2 do I least need to use on something else? And then trying to, maybe put that order marker on Raylan to get her development happened at that point in time. So maybe if you have like Microcore with Raylan, maybe you want to put the 1 and the 2 on Microcore and the 3 on Raylan in your first round, because you want to get the Microcore up there and get those 3 attacks to 4 in on that order marker 2 of that round, and then bring Raylan up to help them survive. Microcore are also a unit there where I might say they have a little less fragility on their own, because they've got that stealth armor ability where they've got a shot to just ignore whatever the wounds they're dealt to them is. So they have just a little bit higher chance of surviving for that turn without Raylan's aura encompassing them than some other units might. Maybe that's an example where you hold off on throwing your Raylan forward. Whereas if maybe your army is all the unique samurai squads, then maybe you want to put Raylan forward much earlier on just to keep good coverage of whatever you're developing.
Chris and Microcore, name a more iconic duo.
They've been doing well for me the last couple of years. I have good things to say about the Microcore.
A well-deserved point boost in Delta back towards their typical points, I would say.
Yeah, they're sitting back at 90 now. I wish they weren't for me, but I think that's fair.
For personal reasons, I wish they were cheaper, but I understand. Yeah. Let's talk about the middle of the game, the heat of battle, you still need to sequence things in the correct order. It's very rare that you end up with a fully homogeneous army, something that is only one unit or maybe one bonding squad with a bonding hero. How do you go about determining what pieces you want to go into other pieces? You talked about Nikitas and Kazuki earlier. This could be things like Kaminawa or a Hydra coming out in the middle game to deal with something specifically, maybe into like an Ashra matchup or something. How do you plan those sub-matchups within a game?
Yeah, so I think that's a really, really important question, because if you don't actively plan those sub-matchups out in the middle of a game, you can very easily find yourself in an end game with a nearly unwinnable game state because you left the wrong piece around to deal with what's left of your opponent. Cayman is definitely a really good example of that as well. Like, if you leave yourself a couple squads of low attack melee units to deal with Cayman in the late game, that's probably not going to go great for you, you know? That's not a matchup where you want. So maybe you know, if you find yourself in that situation, it's possible that you made a mistake by not using that piece, which is your low attack melee squads, in the mid game instead of some other piece that maybe could have dealt with Cayman a little bit better. But there's a couple different questions that go into that. The first is to identify like which of your pieces are good or bad into your opponent's pieces. Again, obviously, like low attack melee into Cayman would be an example of bad. But you have to pair that with trying to pay attention to like what units your opponent's activating currently, right? So maybe they've developed Cayman in the early game, and that's a tip-off to you that they're probably going to try and use Cayman more in the mid-game than the late game. Or maybe he's still sitting in the start zone, and then maybe that's a tip-off on the flip side that, hey, they're probably going to save Cayman towards the late game. And then you can try to sort of use your opponent's board state and how they've developed what to help you think about how you should, you know, which pieces you want to use next in that chess match. One example I have of where I did a poor job of this that is from the ScapeCon East game I had against Fauzing last year, where I ended up theoretically in a game state where I had way more good stuff on the board in the form of a full life Heracles, which is 200 points, versus these puny little 4 Mara warriors, only 50 points. Right, like Heracles was just never going to chase down all those Mara warriors. And so I had to sit there while these 4 Mara warriors ran around the map and pew-pewed into Heracles, and he could do nothing about it. So really, that's the situation, though. Like, you could look at that endgame and say, like, oh, wow, this is unlucky. You got into this endgame state, but I don't think that's the right approach. I think the approach is I made a mistake in the mid-game to leave that endgame state to put myself in a spot where I was going to face that nearly unwinnable endgame state. I think most examples probably aren't quite that extreme, but you know, if you do end up in a situation like that in a game, I think for learning purposes that it's helpful to backtrack and say like, well, could I have used this piece, you know, in that case, Heracles earlier in the game to try to trade for something different that he's a lot better into in a way that left me with something that was a better piece to deal with these pesky little Mara warriors in the late game. And for the end, you know, it's not always the case that you're going to find a better approach for that, but sometimes you will. And those are really good learning opportunities for how you can better manage those sub-pieces of your army in the future.
Yeah, people talk about a win condition occasionally where, Heracles versus Mara Warriors was Fuzing's win condition simply because the Mara Warriors end up dominating. Or another example might be like 2 squads of Warriors of Ashra versus 2 squads of any other melee unit that's really going to struggle to get through the Warriors of Ashra. So I think that is really helpful in terms of thinking about how to achieve the endgame state that you want, not when you get to the endgame and you realize, oh, I should have had this piece for this piece instead, but starting that earlier in the game, you know, more towards the middle or even the opening rounds, trying to match up your opponent's pieces, what you want. That's really interesting.
Now, there's a pretty small list of units that are going to dominate endgames quite that drastically too. And it's, you know, you can always just look at your opponent's army and see if they have one of those pieces. Mara Warriors are probably the most iconic example, just because so many single heroes just can never catch them all. But you know, just take a quick look at your opponent's starts on at the beginning of the game and say, are there any units in there that I just auto lose, that some parts of my army just auto lose to? And if the answer is yes, you know, try to avoid that.
Yes. Yeah, I suppose on the flip side, there might be some units units that don't necessarily generally dominate in an endgame, Q10 is a good endgame piece, but not necessarily the most dominant. But if you only have 2 squads of Goblin Cutters left, then suddenly that is an unwinnable endgame. So also being aware, it might be a little easier for your opponent to have a piece that you auto lose to rather than your opponent generally having a piece that anything auto loses to. We talked about you and your love for Microcore briefly. I know you're also a big fan of the C3V Varkanen faction. I'm also a big fan of the Wolves. The Varks are pretty difficult to play. They can require extremely precise timing, being all unique figures with order markers. For those unaware, each squad can choose to bond with either a Vark hero or another Vark squad, but you can only attack with up to the number of the destroyed figures on the card revealing the order marker. So for example, if I reveal an order marker on my Grey Spears, which have 4 figures and 2 of them have been destroyed, I can move all 3 of my Dark Claws, but I can only attack with 2 of them. So your highest attack output with the bonding squad is also when your bonder squad is the most fragile. So in those cases, it's extremely important to, in my opinion, plan out your attacks for a full round so that you don't lose an order marker or have to retreat and maybe waste attacks to avoid losing an order marker. So in your experience, how do you view the board both early, mid, and late game when it can be very risky, just very risky play with the Varks?
Well, a couple things about Varks that are just play super different than almost anything else in the game that I think is important to touch on here. One is just plain speed. In terms of like covering the board, you can just cover the board with Varks so much faster and quicker than a lot of other things. For example, if your first order marker of the game is on Swift Fangs, and you have Grey Spears as well, and the Grey Spears use tracking, you're moving 4 figures 8 spaces and 4 figures 7 spaces in one turn. That is absurd. That is like way more than even Glad Blast activations can achieve. And you can just completely dominate the middle of the map on most competitive maps just within that one order marker move. And then you have high ground claimed for, the next couple rounds of that game that your opponent's going to have you playing up into. Varks are also just like super fragile though. So you've got to be really careful. This isn't a situation where you've got 5x 10th regiment where losing a couple isn't going to have a huge impact on you. You lose 1 or 2 of those squads of Vark, your army is going to fall apart pretty quickly. But at the same time, Varks have a little bit of some weird reverse incentives where normally when your opponent has a unique squad, you want to kill 1 or 2 of them right off the bat to sort of limit those activations. But Varks don't really play that way. You don't want to kill only 1 unit of each of the Vark squads because then they're able to fully maximize with their conditional attack bonding in a spot like that. So they're going to play, just very differently than a lot of stuff. I think that's one of the reasons I like the faction a lot. And it has some very different incentives with how you want to sort of fast play it. And in terms of like the map itself and development, I think that the biggest thing is to try to develop all the pieces of the army such that they're in position to be used on whichever upcoming order marker you want to use them on as an offensive piece, while not having them be forward deployed for too long to where they're going to take a lot of fire in the meantime. So, for example, Swift Fangs are probably the most obvious example in the Vark squad because you pretty much always want them to charge in on an order marker 1 so they get all the fun boosts. Usually that's going to be round 2 order marker 1. It could be round 3 order marker 1, depending on how the game's played out or whatnot. But in a case like that, you don't want to send them too far forward a couple order markers before that one where they're going to get shot at too much. You want to try and keep them a little bit more, conservative and safe. Also, you can afford to get away with that with Swift Fangs a lot because when they do take that order marker 1, they end up having 8 move. So they're able to cover a lot more ground to make up for sort of a conservative placement earlier while still getting a ton of attack output on that following turn. There's sometimes with the Vark squads as well, I think you kind of want to develop like sort of a mixture of a squad. So like not necessarily, in the case of the Dark Claws, frequently I think you don't want to send like all 3 of them forward all at once. I'm going to steal a description that I've gotten from Cleon about these because I think it's a really helpful and useful one, where Cleon described Dark Claws to me once as being a unique squad that you want to play like 3 unique heroes sequentially, sending 1 in at a time while you have the, say, Grey Spears back further as the order marker hub for that. Because one of the things you can accomplish with that is, especially if you're facing an army that doesn't have a ton of range, you send in that one Dark Claw. Instead, you have one Dead Grey Spirit. You send in that one Dark Claw, you get its double attack off, and it's now holding your entire opponent's army stuck in some spot of the map where they are engaged it. And it's got at least 4 defense, maybe more on height, maybe with shadow. And it's going to kind of force them to almost take an entire turn just to kill that one unit. And then on the next turn, you can shift that next Dark Claw in there and get some more Grey Spirit attacks behind it, and you can do that repeatedly. So there's just some cool stuff like that you can pull off with the Vark squads to try to manipulate the map state. And then you've also got the spirits on the Vark, obviously. So all the Vark heroes have a spirit power to where when they die, you can put them on some other type of card in your army, very similar to all the Vikings from classic Heroscape. So, when you're doing like army construction builds, sometimes if you've got Arctos, for example, in there, who gives +2 range to some unique card that you can put them on, I like to pair that sometimes with B11 or Morrow Warriors in the same army, because those are really nice endgame pieces that benefit a lot from having that +2 range. So it's sort of like a little side aspect there as to like how you can do army construction to maximize the full value of the Vark spirit in a case like that.
That's a really insightful look at the Vark factions. I really like that description of the Dark Claws as a unique squad. You play like 3 unique heroes. I haven't thought about them like that before. I like seeing. I feel like I've seen more and more players beginning to use the Varks, or at least become more comfortable playing against them. They're really, in my opinion, one of the coolest design factions in VC. I'll come out and say it. I'll be brave. I think it's one of the coolest VC factions that they've come out with. So I would encourage everyone to give them a try for that reason. Moving towards the end of our discussion, in moving towards the end of a game as well, we don't like to admit this as competitive players, but certain situations in an endgame can just come down to luck. For me, I know it can feel like once every game that there's an initiative on which the entire game hinges. So how do you mitigate risk and reward in these situations? And how does that determine where you place order markers? How much of that is determined by statistics or even like gamesmanship with X order marker bluffs?
Well, I think that there's plenty of things in Heroscape that just come down to luck. There's obviously the end game stuff that's talking about, but there's also just tremendous numbers of other things that are outside your control. What opponent you get matched up against. When you show up to a tournament for round 1, do you get matched up against a new player or a great player? That's going to have a pretty outsized impact on your chance to win that event. What your opponent's army ends up being, like how well does it happen to counter you? Do you get placed on a map that's good for you? Do you get glyphs that are good for you? Going back to Vark briefly there, the unique attack glyph is just like so busted good for the Vark squad. I won an OHS event and almost exclusively because the finals map happened to have the unique attack glyph for my Varks on it, which was, that's a pretty big form of luck. And then still, there can be some event-specific things, like a reverse the whip, when you face a specific opponent. Is it a regular round or a reversed round? But in terms of like end-game situations and mitigating risk-reward there, let's consider sort of 2 different distributions that you can do with order markers. The first is where you put 2 order markers on one card and 2 order markers on another card. Well, in that case, you've told your opponent that each card is going to take at least 1 turn, and it's unclear which one's going to take 2 turns. There's going to be some game states where you might want that uncertainty to last longer into the round, in which case you might take you're 1 on one card and then you're 2 on the other card. But the downside of doing that is your opponent might be able to look into that and figure out that your 2 was going to be on the other card if you're someone who habitually tries to leave the bluff for the late game stage. So sometimes you might want to mix in that bluff at an earlier stage, or maybe the 1 and the 2 are on that same first card, and then your 3 is on the other card. Some people are, I've seen some situations where people are a little bit hesitant to do that because they say, oh, my opponent's going to know where my 3 is for sure. But I've definitely been in some states where I knew where my opponent's 2 was for sure, because I knew that they were going to always alternate that 1 and the 2. And so once they revealed the 1 in one spot, I was nearly 100% certain that the 2 was on the other card. So you want to have some sort of healthy mix of balance between those 2 things. The other example for order marker bluffs, I would say, is when you're going to have like 3 order markers on one card and 1 order marker on the other card. And in that situation, you could really have that hidden order marker, that single one, be any of them, and it could work out reasonably for you, depending on the situation. There are some situations where you might want to make that bluff contingent upon initiative. So maybe you have a figure that has only a couple life left and could have died easily. Maybe you really want to take that order marker 1 on him, though. Maybe you put only a single order marker on him, knowing that if you win initiative, you get to use it. And if you lose initiative, maybe your opponent looks at the fact that it only has 1 order marker and thinks maybe it's the X and ignores him. So that could be a situation where maybe you want to use the bluff earlier in the round. The flip side of that might be if you have a hero, maybe you've got, say, a hero that only has a couple lives left, but he's got a lot of defense and he's going to survive for a couple rounds. Maybe you put the 1, 2, and the X on that one figure, and then the 3 on something else, to where you're trying to play that bluff as, maybe if your opponent hasn't quite killed that figure after your order marker 2, maybe they continue to try to finish off that figure and focus attack on him, even though that figure doesn't have any more order markers for the round sitting on them. So different situations with how you can distribute them and how you can use the bluff at different stages of the round.
I actually have 2 concrete examples from Lincoln Seasonal the other day, if you don't mind. Examples from one game in one round where my opponent and I use both distributions, if you don't mind. Maybe this will help sort of concrete these ideas into these more abstract ideas into reality. It was an endgame state where my opponent had Zoth, Mouth of the Abyss, and 2 knights left. I had a full health Kato Katsuro and 1 single Ashigaru Rifleman left. I put my 1, 2, and my X on Kato and my 3 on the Ashigaru, knowing that my opponent would pile on to Kato and hope that he would leave the Ashigaru alone. So in that instance, I was bluffing the X, dumping 3 order markers onto one card and hoping they would ignore the Rifleman. My opponent split order markers on his 3 life Zoth and his 2 knights left. Now, we got to a position where I got to take my turn 2 with Kato before he took his turn 3 with only 1 knight left and a very wounded Mouth of the Abyss. But because he put his 1 on his knights and his 2 on his Mouth of the Abyss, I had no idea where his 3rd order marker was. And if I guessed wrong, it was going to be very punishing for me, depending on where I managed to put my order markers. Now, I guessed right, and he had it on knights, and I managed to buy myself some time. Unfortunately, my Rifleman actually got killed in the crossfire of a Shattered Minds attack from Mouth of the Abyss. So I did not actually manage to get that surprise turn with the Rifleman. But as collateral, he wasn't actually directly targeting him. It was more an attack of opportunity. So we both managed to bluff each other by splitting up those order markers in different distributions, depending on how we wanted that round to go. Hopefully that description makes sense.
Yeah, it's a cool example, and it's also worth noting when you're doing that. If you have a way to distribute your order markers like that, that's more robust for whether you win or lose the initiative. That could be worth going for over. So sometimes your order marker distribution is going to be very heavily dependent on. Like, sometimes that bluff is going to be obvious or not based on whether you win or lose initiative and sort of how the order of those order markers play out. But yeah, if you've got an opportunity maybe to preserve the bluff.
Sure. No, I understand what you're saying. There's moments where you want to bluff right out of the gate at the beginning of the round. If you lose initiative, you might want your opponent to target the X. But as soon as you reveal your first order marker, it's very obvious that the X is on that other card with the single order marker.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they know that for the rest of the round.
Which can still be worth doing.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'd say that all these distributions could be worth doing. The question is just trying to identify the right spot in the game to use the various options available to you.
Yes, I think knowing your opponent, this is easier to do online with a smaller community than going to a local or something, unless you know the local players very well. The opponent actually, in that example, happened to be my brother, which is why I managed to guess right, because we played against each other so much, and he also managed to snip off that X order marker as collateral, because he also knows that I like to get a little tricky with order marker placement. I know I saw in a discussion not that long ago where a player was commenting that they had managed to trick you with an order marker because they knew that you would expect them to make the right approach, like you would expect every other player to make the optimal approach that you would make, and so they took a suboptimal approach to order markers and managed to surprise you, which I think is really funny. And I know I certainly would consider my bluff differently into a newer player who maybe wouldn't even consider what I'm doing versus a very good player who would sort of expect a distribution and maybe expect the same order marker distribution that I would plan to do myself, if not to trick them into doing something else. So I agree. I do think that level of the game, that very small piece of the game is a little bit underexplored. I do think as the competitive community grows, and also the average skill of the competitive player grows, I think we'll maybe see a little bit more of that in the future.
Yeah, I've definitely gotten tricked. In a few spots by what I think would be considered the suboptimal order markers in theory, catching me by surprise just because I was expecting the other version. It's definitely a cool play when you can pull it off. It's not something you want to do more than half the time, for instance, because then you find yourself stuck doing the suboptimal thing, a little too often. But there's definitely a good frequency to try to pull something like that off, where you're doing it so infrequently enough that your opponent's not expecting it, but then that means it's going to end up working out pretty well for you a couple times when you do go for it. Yeah, it's definitely a fun play to go for.
If there's anything else you would like to say to close out, I know I'm looking forward to ScapeCon. I'm sure you are as well. Yeah, if there's anything you'd like to let our listener know, feel free to go ahead.
Honestly, probably not, because it's not going to come out until after ScapeCon and Gen Con. So,
I guess.
Yeah, probably nothing in particular.
If Chris went, I guess I'll say if Chris went like 0-30 at ScapeCon, I won't release this. So if you're listening to this, Chris won at least one game, enough to make me feel like this was worthwhile to put out.
I think it might be more impressive if I go 0-30. That'd be hard to do.
I think you might be the first winless player at ScapeCon. Well, this has been really insightful, Chris. I'm really glad that you could join me in my cozy study here. Leave a like if this topic was helpful to you, and subscribe if you'd like to see more topics like this. We're entering a new age of competitive Heroscape, and we'd love to bring you along for the ride. And of course, while listening to Heroscape Strategems is clearly the best way to improve at the game, the second best way is to join the online community or find your nearest local tournament. And if there isn't one, well, you can do what I did and start your own. So thanks again, Chris, and we'll see you in Valhalla.